In 1951, seasoned mountaineer Eric Shipton and his colleague Michael Ward were scouting an approach to Everest. They were traversing the treacherous Menlung Glacier on the Nepal-Tibet border when they encountered something strange. There in the snow, a huge footprint stared back at them. The print was humanoid, yet not quite human. About 13 in long, unusually broad, with a divergent big toe that looked almost like a thumb. The print was just one of many. In fact, Shipton and Ward followed these tracks for a mile, which is no mean feat at an altitude above 4,000 dawarines. What made these marks in the remote heights of the Himalayas? Could it really be a Yeti? And if not, well, what on earth was it that these esteemed mountaineers saw? I'm Zinnia, and you're watching The Explorer Now. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Why is he making a video about Yetis? Clearly, there's no way these things can be real, right? And I would have agreed with you. Really, I would. But something about Yetis is just always bothered me. Every year, there's a new story, a new discovery, a new leaked picture somewhere online, and how can there be this much smoke without fire? If it's not a Yeti that we're seeing, then it has to be something else. And I want to know what that is. That's just how my brain works. So, join me in this video as we delve into the world of the fabled Yeti and meet its Amazonian equivalent known as the Mapinguari. How is it that centuries-old rumors of their existence still circulate? Is there any truth behind the swaths of evidence? Or can science finally explain what lies hidden in the wilderness? High up in the Himalayan peaks and the Tibetan plateau, legends tell of a hairy ape-like wild man that stalks the mountains. The Sherpa people call it the Yeti, a term which roughly means wild man of the rocks. In Tibetan folklore, it's sometimes thought of as a spirit of the glaciers or an elusive mountain creature. Westerners came to know it by a slightly more flamboyant name, shall we say, the Abominable Snowman, a moniker coined in 1921 when journalist Henry Newman interviewed members of a British Everest reconnaissance expedition. The mountaineers described seeing large footprints at high altitude, and local porters filled in the gaps, suggesting they were left by the Meto Kangmi, or man-bear snowman in Tibetan, over a century later, and the name stuck, igniting Western fascination. Even Sir David Attenborough, my personal hero and universally respected natural history expert, has said the legendary Yeti could really exist and be living in the Himalayan mountains. So, what's the truth? Throughout the 20th century, the Yeti legend grew as climbers and adventurers reported strange sightings. In 1925, a Greek photographer named N.A. Tombazi claimed he saw a dark humanoid figure leaving footprints on a snowfield at $15,000 ft. By the 1950s, outsiders were pouring into Nepal. After news broke that Sir Edmund Hillary conquered Everest in 1953, the Yeti story captured global imagination, and perhaps coincidentally, sightings and stories proliferated. An American oil financier, Tom Slick, funded multiple expeditions. The Daily Mail newspaper even sponsored a hunt in 1954, and 6 years later, even Sir Edmund Hillary himself organized an expedition, at least in part, to investigate the Yeti mystery. Not wanting to miss out, the government of Nepal also got involved. Keen to capitalize on the craze, they started offering officially regulated Yeti searches for any brave, intrepid travelers. In 1959, they even issued rules, for Yeti expeditions, requiring a hefty permit fee and declaring that if a Yeti were found, it must not be killed, except, of course, in self-defense. In fact, any evidence at all had to be surrendered to the state, and so the stage was set for a series of intriguing discoveries. This, the photograph we shared at the start of the video, is perhaps the most iconic piece of evidence in Yeti law, an image of a supposed Yeti footprint snapped in Nepal by mountaineer Eric Shipton and his colleague Michael Ward. Now, aside from just looking impressive, the fact it was Shipton himself who found it, a highly respected explorer, electrified the world. The media ran wild with the possibility, dubbing the print the Rosetta Stone of Yeti evidence. Over subsequent years, as you can imagine, footprints remained a key piece of evidence cited by Yeti hunters. Plaster casts were made of some prints, and one famous one even made it to Disneyland. But footprints weren't the only clues. There were other physical artifacts, too. In some remote Buddhist monasteries of Nepal, monks safeguarded curious relics, scalps, and bones attributed to Yetis, locked up and stashed away from prying eyes. The most famous of these is the so-called Yeti scalp of Kumjung, a hairy half-sphere of hide housed in the village of Kumjung. During Edmund Hillary's 1960 expedition, he actually managed to borrow this scalp with permission, of course, from the lamas. He even brought it back to Europe and the US for scientific examination. And the results, well, not good. Zoologists found that the scalp was not from an unknown primate at all, but rather had been fashioned from the hide of a sirau, a Himalayan goat antelope. In other words, the monk's relic was likely a ceremonial artifact made from animal skin rather than a gigantic humanoid covered in hair. Hillary later returned the scalp to Nepal, along with this rather disappointing news. In fact, this happened more than once, as Hillary's team also scrutinized other Yeti remains. Many of those other relics turned out to be from bears. Hillary had found no compelling trace of an unknown monster lurking in the Himalayas. So much so that by the end of his quest, he remarked that he had wanted to bring back the truth, and that was not a Yeti. To quote Hillary himself, he could not in all conscience view it as more than a fascinating fairy tale. Today, a replica of the Kumjung scalp is on display at the Explorers Club in New York City, while the original is still kept under lock and key by the monastery, displayed to visitors for a small donation. So, if you want to see what a gulp antelope hive looks like, well, there you go. Another famous relic was the so-called Pangbosh hand. Unsurprisingly, given its name, it can be found in the Pangbosh Monastery not far from Everest. Here, some monks had a mummified skeletal hand and a skull cap on display, which they claimed belonged to a Yeti. Of course they did. This relic came from the great Sherpa leader Lama Sangwa Dorje, who in the 17th century went to southern Tibet to study Buddhism. While there, he meditated in a cave near Pangboche, where he claimed a Yeti brought him food, water, and fuel, and even became his Buddhist disciple. When the Yeti died, Sangwa kindly brought his hand and scalp back to the monastery. So, could this one be real? Well, in 1958, on the orders of Tom Slick, the oil financer bloke I mentioned earlier, and after much debate by the monks, Peter Byrne, a well-known Everest explorer, managed to obtain a single finger from the hand in exchange for a rather large donation toward the temple's upkeep and a replacement human finger. I'm not sure I want to know where he got that one from, actually. Anyway, if you thought that was weird, this story takes a turn no one could ever dream of. Byrne then smuggled the finger and some extra hand skin across the Nepalese border into India, where he met American movie star James Stewart and his wife Gloria in Kolkata. The famous couple agreed to smuggle the finger back into the United Kingdom to Slick's friend and primatologist Osman Hill, a member of the Zoological Society of London, to study it. Now, the story goes, they pulled off the heist by hiding the remains inside Gloria Stewart's undergarments inside her luggage. So after all of that, the finger did indeed finally make it to London for analysis by William Osman Hill, who initially reported the finger might be from a Neanderthal, whilst another American anthropologist, George Agagino, claimed it was near human, sparking huge excitement. Sadly, upon closer analysis, it was eventually determined to be of actual human origin, rather killing the mood and opening up a whole different series of questions. Decades later, this was further confirmed by DNA testing. As for the rest of the Pangboche hand and scalp, well, those relics were unfortunately stolen in the 1990s. They were likely taken by artifact hunters after media reports, but in a modern twist. A replica of the hand was crafted by Veda Workshop, the people known for creating Lord of the Rings props, and delivered to the monastery in 2011 to placate the monks. So maybe in that sense, the legend of the Yeti lives on in Middle-earth. Beyond relics and prints, the best evidence comes from eyewitness reports in the Himalayas. In 1986, Reinhold Messner, one of the world's greatest mountaineers, claimed he came face to face with a large, hairy, bipedal creature during a solo trek in Tibet. Messner was initially convinced he had encountered a Yeti. So convinced, in fact, he became rather obsessed with the concept, spending years investigating. Eventually, however, he concluded the creature he saw was not the fabled beast at all, but likely a bear, the rare Tibetan blue bear or Himalayan brown bear, and perhaps rather sadly for him, came to the conclusion that the Yeti exists only as a myth. Another incident the same year involved British climber Anthony Wardridge, who even took photographs of what he believed to be a Yeti, only to realize later on it was just an oddly shaped rock formation. Many Sherpa and Tibetan locals also recount stories of glimpsing Yetis in forests or during yak herding trips, describing them as shaggy, upright creatures that flee quickly or vanish in an instant. In fact, Sherpa tradition often held the Yeti as a spiritual or magical being. Seeing one was considered an ill omen, but it was the seeing one that still remained a problem. Even the Indian Army was at it. In a more recent case in 2019, they announced they had found Yeti footprints near a base camp measuring a gigantic 32x15 in. They even tweeted photos of the tracks. The claim was met with widespread ridicule and skepticism, however, and experienced trackers immediately noted the prints likely came from a bear. So, the Army quietly let the matter drop rather quickly after the initial publicity. So it's not looking good for Yetis in this part of the world, but our quest continues because there is another place on Earth to look where something even more terrifying is rumored to lurk. While the Himalayas were buzzing with Yeti fever in the 1950s, the Amazon jungle had its own monstrous myth. Indigenous peoples in the Amazon basin, Brazil, Bolivia, and beyond spoke of something called the Mapinguari, a fearsome, shaggy creature said to lurk in the green depths of the rainforest undergrowth. Descriptions of the Mapinguari vary, but they consistently paint a nightmarish picture. A giant beast over 7 feet tall when it rears up, covered in matted reddish fur, and armed with enormous curved claws capable of tearing apart palm trees and humans in an instant. Even more disturbingly, legend has it that this grotesque beast is so ravenous for human flesh, it has a second mouth on its belly. If that were not warning enough to stay your distance, the creature is also said to give off an overpowering odor, a stench so foul that humans allegedly faint or become disorientated when it's near. Locals claim it has backward-facing feet to confuse anyone trying to track it. And it's so fearsome that even bullets don't kill it, bouncing off its tough hide like rubber. So it's not difficult to see why the Mapinguari drew the interests of scientists and cryptozoologists. Those the people studying animals whose existence is unproven in the 20th century. After all, the Amazon is so vast and was so unexplored at the time, it seems plausible a big unknown animal could be hiding there somewhere. So why not this one? One tantalizing theory emerged. Perhaps the Mapinguari was not an ape or wild man at all, but instead a surviving giant ground sloth. To paleontologists, this wasn't as far-fetched as it sounds. Enormous ground-dwelling sloths related to today's tree sloth, but the size of bears or even elephants did once exist across South America. Fossil remains of the giant Megatherium and its relatives show they were bear-like herbivores with long claws, able to stand up on 2 legs, and often had red fur as inferred from preserved hair. The only problem was they were thought to have gone extinct at least 5,000 years ago, but that didn't stop people from looking for them. In the 1990s, Dr. David C. Oren, a then-respected ornithologist and research director at Brazil's Goeldi Museum, took up the mantle of the Mapinguari. Initially dismissive of it as folklore, Oren changed his mind after hearing dozens of first-hand accounts from Amazonian hunters and villagers. By 1994, he hypothesized that the Mapinguari could indeed be a relic population of medium-sized giant ground sloths, surviving in remote areas. And if true, it would be a discovery on par with finding a living dinosaur. He set about interviewing witnesses that had braved the jungle, enduring clouds of insects, oppressive heat, and treacherous terrain, searching for any sign of the beast. Some of the accounts he collected were pretty compelling. One hunter, João dos Santos, described hearing an unearthly human-like scream in the forest that made his hair stand on end. When he saw trees thrashing and realized the Mapinguari was coming, he ran in terror, hiding in a river for an hour. Another man claimed a Mapinguari's horrid smell left him dizzy and sick for 2 months after an encounter. Chilling as these tales are, what Oren needed was tangible evidence. During more than 6 expeditions spread across the 1990s into the early 2000s, Oren set about collecting samples from the field to try and prove his theories. He found large tracks about 11 inches long with a stride suggesting a sizable creature and made plaster casts. He gathered tufts of coarse hair snagged on branches and even analyzed dung piles locals attributed to the Mapinguari. For a time, these finds fueled hope. The footprint, if genuine, hinted at a heavy animal. The hairs were reddish and fibrous. Every discovery felt like a step toward unearthing this creature. But then along came scientific analysis. When Oren sent the hair for testing, it turned out to belong to an ordinary agouti, a common rainforest rodent whose fur had gotten caught on brush. The fecal samples were tested for DNA traces. It was from a giant anteater. The casts of footprints, while intriguing, could not be taken as proof. Even Oren himself admitted the tracks are easily faked in a region where hoaxing a gullible foreign scientist might be an amusing pastime for locals. In the end, despite years of effort, Oren did not find the fabled beast. There wasn't even a blurry photo, no unknown DNA, no sloth in the flesh, nothing but disappointment. By the mid-2000s, Dr. Oren reluctantly conceded that the Mapinguari is likely only a legend. He speculated that the folklore might be a cultural memory of real encounters with the last ground sloths from centuries ago passed down in exaggerated form. Extinct species can survive as legends for hundreds of years, Oren told the New York Times in 2007. But whether such an animal still exists or not is another question, one we can't answer. He said, "A lot has changed in the last 60 years, and with ever more accurate tests have come some increasingly interesting results, particularly when it comes to DNA analysis. This technology has not only been a game changer in modern forensics, but also when it comes to examining mysterious biological samples." In 2012, a team led by Brian Sykes at Oxford University undertook an ambitious project. They actually put out an open call for alleged Yeti and Bigfoot samples. They wanted everything from hairs and bones to tissues and, to be quite honest, anything else. All in an attempt to put the rumors to the test and gain a definitive answer, which is what I think we all want. Perhaps unsurprisingly, they were inundated, receiving dozens of submissions. After weeding out some obvious fakes, for example, some hairs were actually fiberglass, plant material, or even glass strands, Sykes' team genetically tested the viable samples. Away from the terrifying stories of flesh-eating, bullet-repelling beasts, the reality was a little different. To test the hairs, the team used a standard forensic method. A small piece of each hair was cleaned and broken down with an enzyme called proteinase K, essentially a molecular scissor that frees up the DNA. Then a short mitochondrial fragment was extracted, the type often used in wildlife forensics because it survives well even when samples are old or damaged. They amplified this tiny stretch of DNA and compared it to a genetic library to see which species it matched. Even a sequence this small is generally enough to pinpoint the species because each animal has a unique pattern of mutations. If the fragment doesn't match any living species, well, that's when scientists start getting excited. But that wasn't quite the case here. Most samples turned out to come from mundane sources. Everyday animals like cows, horses, bears, and in one case, even a human. I hope someone's keeping a track of all the human remains in this video, by the way, because something's going on. But it wasn't all bad news. Sykes reported that 2 Himalayan samples had DNA closer to an ancient polar bear than to any known modern species. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a glimmer of hope that something unknown, something abnormal could be roaming the Himalayas sprung back to life. Something enthusiasts hurriedly linked to the Yeti. The media frenzy was as intense as the Yeti sightings of old. Just imagine finally actual scientific evidence of a giant polar bear-like creature lurking in Tibet. Finally, they had cracked the case. That was until something brought Sykes and the millions of other intrepid Yeti hunters crashing back down to Earth. Almost immediately, other geneticists challenged the findings, and a reanalysis indicated that the sequences likely belonged to a normal Himalayan brown bear, and that Sykes had most probably matched a fragment to an ancient polar bear in error. A couple of years later, the proverbial nail was put into the coffin with a definitive genetic study in 2017. Led by Charlotte Lindquist, an international team conducted the most rigorous analysis of purported Yeti remains to date. Unlike earlier work, the team generated much longer and far more informative mitochondrial sequences, in some cases assembling complete mitochondrial genomes for the very first time. This meant that the scientists could distinguish closely related species with confidence and avoid the false matches that can happen with degraded fragments. Genetically speaking, this leaves little room for mystery. Using advanced DNA sequencing, Lindquist's group compared the samples to comprehensive genetic data from known regional wildlife. And the verdict was clear. Every single sample corresponded to known animals. What people called Yetis were in fact bears all along. Bears whose fur, footprints, or other traces were misidentified, blown up in the media, and made into something mysterious. Beyond DNA, other scientific work has also set out to demystify classic Yeti evidence. Remember Shipton's famous footprint with the thumb? Well, Daniel Taylor, a conservationist who spent decades studying Yeti reports, also suspected a bear was the culprit for this. To put his theory to the test, he conducted a short experiment using a tranquilized Asiatic black bear. He pressed the bear's paw into soft earth to simulate tracks. Sure enough, the bear's hind foot, which in Asian black bears has a flexible big toe for climbing, left the print strikingly similar to the Shipton photo, including a thumb-like indentation. The overlapping of bear hind and fore prints in melting snow can also create the illusion of a giant bipedal track. Other mountaineers have noted that snow can distort prints. A small depression enlarges as some melts the edges, and repeated melting and refreezing can make a bear's paw or even yak hoof look surprisingly like an enormous human footprint. These natural, even slightly boring explanations don't capture headlines like a monster story, but they do fit the data far better. After examining a century's worth of expeditions, eyewitness tales, and scientific tests to finally scratch my Yeti itch, the answer is pretty clear. The Yeti, the Mapinguari, and their kin around the world, whether it's Bigfoot of North America or the Yahi of Australia, have not been proven real in the biological sense and exist only in a fictional one. Despite the footprints in the snows of Everest and the screams in the Amazon night, no body alive or dead has ever been found. But despite the evidence lacking for a flesh and blood, bipedal ape, the Yeti does live on in another way as a cultural phenomenon. In this vein, the Yeti is very real and quite significant, shaping local traditions, inspiring conservation in wild places, and keeping the sense of wonder alive in an age of satellites and smartphones. That is the power of the Yeti legend, a story that, true or not, will continue to captivate and inspire wherever wilderness remains. Let me know in the comments if you've heard any other stories of Yetis or Bigfoot. Maybe you've even found a footprint or seen something lurking in the distance. Or do you think there's something science might have missed? Could the Yeti really be alive and well? Let us know down below, and we'll see you in the next one.